Okay, guys. So the work that I left you guys for the last 2 weeks were things that I was going to be doing in class with regards to evolution. So I guess I'm glad we finished up that harder unit on DNA to RNA to protein. And now we're going to talk about evolution. I really miss seeing everybody. This is kind of, well, it's a very crazy situation. But some of the things that we're going to be talking about now um, are going to be kind of more difficult and involve some math. So I figured I'm going to do a couple of videos now that I've kind of settled in, and hopefully that you're settled in. Um, and I'll do a couple of videos and maybe some like Google Meets or something so we can go through some of the problems together. So I just kind of want to get my feet back wet into making these sorts of videos. And I'm going to be using, instead of the iPad, which I'm used to using, or my smartboard, I'm going to try using a tablet that I have. So I might be a little bit awkward with writing with it for a while, but I'm going to try to go with writing instead of typing for this. Um, so you can kind of follow along in your handout with me, and maybe put this like on a half and half screen. Maybe I'll do a tutorial on that. I can figure that out. All right, so let's see what color I want to use here. Okay, I'll just use blue. So we're going to look at some factors, and you probably learned a lot of these already from the different things in the Five Fingers of Evolution and some of the other ones about natural selection. But looking at some factors that drive evolution here, the first one that we're looking at here, we see this tan beetle is moving from a population of tan beetles. Remember, population is a group of the same species living in a certain area, which these are, and moving into a different population. This might even be this. It's going to be a different population of the same species, but they're different. There's differences in their phenotype, so that there's differences in their genes and genotypes as well. So we have this beetle moving in from this population to that population. And that is something called gene flow. And all gene flow means, kind of like it sounds, is going to be the movement of genes or alleles from one population to another. That's all gene flow is. So in this other case here, we see these birds, and the red one is going to be moving, or the blue one is moving over to the red population. It looks like. Okay, that's all gene flow is. Okay, that one's we call that, if we're talking about just like in social studies, we call that immigration, when we have individuals moving into our populations from other populations. Or if we are leaving a population, we call that emigration. And that's the same for animals and plants as well. So gene flow, the movement of genes from one population to another. And when you have gene flow, that is going to be something that in some cases will introduce new genes to other populations, but in some ways it kind of also will make it so the population isn't evolving, isn't changing. Next concept here is changes in populations that happen due to chance events. And in this case here, and this concept, I'm just going to put the name up here, is called genetic drift. And genetic drift are things that happen due to chance events. And we have a population here, and it just so happens, so again, it's a chance event, that we have some brown beetles here and some green beetles. And this guy is so rudely coming in and stepping on some beetles. Hopefully, he did not mean to do that, but it just so happens that he takes out a lot of the genetic diversity that was in that population because he just happened to, he didn't mean to do it. It wasn't driven by choice, it was a chance event. And he happened to take out a lot of the uh, portions of the green beetles. So you went from having 2/3, no, 2/3 tan and 1/3 green, and then after that, we just have 1/7 green. So we went from having 2/3, 1/3 to 1/7 of that green phenotype in our population, but that was due to a chance event. Again, it wasn't due to the fact that he didn't like green beetles and he only wanted to kill green beetles, because that would not be a chance event. Chance event, he just happened to step down. And so in this case, genetic drift is more likely to cause evolution when we're dealing with small populations. So small populations are extremely sensitive to genetic drift, because you can imagine if it was a big population and they were kind of all mixed up and he just kind of stepped onto, it wouldn't have had as much of an effect on it. And we see that here, where we started off with equal amounts of each of the alleles. And sometimes this is called like a bottleneck effect, because imagine that this was a thing of beads or something here, and we just happened to flip the bottle over, and this is what we ended up with. And just by chance, again, that's kind of what I want to stress here, is that these are due to chance events. We have all of the yellow gene was taken out there, so that was lost. And then our new population was founding this new population based on that chance event. So that's sometimes called a founder effect, or sometimes called a bottleneck. So the event itself, the chance event, is called a bottleneck, and then the new population being founded from the survivors of the bottleneck are that's called a founder effect. All right. So again, same thing here. Let's say that there was some sort of event that took out just this part of this. If this was a piece of land or something, took out that land just by chance. The new population was founded by just these green individuals. So you lost some genetic diversity by genetic drift. All right. So the next thing I'm going to talk about, we've talked about quite a bit, but I just kind of wanted to make, just since I have this here, kind of go through what, just kind of summarize the things from the Darwin movie that we watched, because that's going to be really important. So first thing about natural selection is that we always have, and I think maybe these types are, maybe I'll use this one here, not natural selection in a nutshell here. So in this population, so we have overpopulation. So that's a tenet of natural selection. We're always going to have, in any population, you're always going to have more offspring that are produced than could possibly survive. So that's called overpopulation. And so more offspring are, that's kind of how nature kind of accounts for the fact that there's things that are going to be happening, but overpopulation, and there will be a competition. Oh, wait. Let me go back here. Sorry about that. And in that overpopulation, there is going to be natural variation. There is going to be natural variation. And so there's going to be difference in, and Darwin didn't know about like what causes that variation. He didn't know. Remember, he was kind of working around the same time as Mendel, so he didn't know about genes or DNA or any of that stuff. But he knew that there was variation, and of those varieties, those varieties. I don't think I spelled that right, but you guys get the idea. Those varieties will compete for limited resources. This is where I would ask you, like, what are those resources? And I think we talked about this in the beginning of the year, but first things that we would compete for would be for things like food and things like shelter, place to live, but also don't forget about the competition for mates. And there will be a differential survival, and not only survival, but a differential survival and reproduction. So I'm going to kind of word that by saying those varieties sorry, I'm struggling with varieties that are better suited. And again, that better suited is from their genetics. We know that now. That are better suited will have a better chance of, not necessarily the only chance, will have a better chance, more chances to not only survive, because survival is going to be important, but it doesn't do you much good if you survive, but then you don't reproduce. As far as I'm talking about as far as natural selection genetics goes, but have more chance to survive and also to reproduce, thereby over time. It's kind of like a long paragraph, and I'm just breaking it up into different parts. Over time will become those varieties that are better suited. I'll spell it different in each one. Those varieties are, it's not, those varieties will become more popular. Popular in terms of, numbers. So just to kind of, again, review those ideas of natural selection, there's going to be overpopulation. And if there's no variation, then it doesn't, none of the rest of this stuff matters as far as natural selection goes. But if there is variation, those varieties will compete with each other for limited resources, such as food, shelter, and mates. And those varieties that are better suited to their situation will have more chance to survive and reproduce. And over time, they will become more popular. So that's what I'm kind of showing here with this picture I am showing here. Natural selection. So what's important to realize is that we have a population, an overpopulation. This is of bacteria, and there are resistant bacteria. And when I had you guys do that evolution misconception, I wanted you to get the idea that there's nothing about this antibiotic that's causing that resistance or causing that mutation. So natural selection, the kind of like palette of natural selection is mutation. So without mutation, you don't get any variation. Remember, the most important thing to remember about mutation, and we didn't get too much time to talk about that because I was sick too, is not with coronavirus, but is mutation is a random event. So a situation can't cause a mutation to happen. So a lot of times people say, "Oh, well, they put these antibiotics on them and they're causing mutations." No, absolutely not. The mutations exist naturally. They exist because there's always going to be some mutation every time populations DNA anytime DNA replicates itself. And what happens is then the antibiotics will kill out these, and then you're left with a population of mostly the ones that are resistant. And that's how bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics. So remember, mutation. And then these are kind of just these like characteristic, like I think these are finches, yeah. Just showing the beak sizes, and these are kind of like your classic example of Darwin's finches, which remember in the movie said that didn't really impress by the finches. He kind of all just lumped them together, and they kind of went, once Darwin did some other work in the Galapagos, then they went back and really looked at those finches. And each different island that had different original food sources, it looks like the bird changed itself in response to the food that was there, but that's not the case. It's those mutations are happening randomly and naturally, and those ones that are better suited are going to have a better chance to get that food, better chance to survive and reproduce and get their genes into the next generation. So what I like to kind of, and this might not be something that you guys think of a lot, but I like to always think of evolution as being, again, we want to not forget that mutation is random, and that is kind of like our palette that natural selection can use to create these different variations. These are just some keywords. I could spell variations, not varieties. And forgot where I was going with that. But so I like to think of mutation and the variation as being the environment doesn't cause that change. That change happens randomly. And that I consider mutation in terms of natural selection to be a pre-existing condition. So for example, I don't want to necessarily harp on the coronavirus. I've talked a little bit about it, and I'm fascinated by it. Um, but so let's say there's some people who end up being, and I don't know if this is the case. They say something like 70% of people will be infected or something like that. Some people don't ever get symptoms or something. Um, some people might not get infected even when they're exposed. This happens with a lot of diseases. That happens all the time with flu. So I could have just said, the flu. So you can't just like say, oh, I mean, we obviously understand this, but you can't change your genes in response to the environment. Now, you might have even seen or heard that there's some. I'll just go to Google to get this for a second. Um, I don't. This has not been proven or anything. Blood type, coronavirus. I don't want to scare anybody either. I'm blood type A. And who knows? Like, I haven't read the paper. We don't know if people don't know if this is true or not, but you might have heard it in the news. But I just want to kind of give it as an example. Um, all right. So there's some research coming out of China, I guess, that shows that um, blood type A is more vulnerable to coronavirus, and blood type O is less vulnerable. And people have kind of really kind of latched onto that. And again, that's just one study, but they looked at basically like 200 people, and something like, I think it was something like, um, let's see. So the point of it is here is that like when everything looks at like it's type A is slightly more susceptible to coronavirus. And remember, 40% of people are type A, and slight type O would have slightly less than you would predict based on how common that blood type is. But again, nobody knows if that's really true or why it's true and stuff. But like, so you would, so 25% of people had type O, but when you look at the population, um, I guess of Wuhan, it's very similar, not well, a little bit off, but um, you would expect that 34 out of 100 people, 34 of them would have it. So it's slightly less than you would expect. And if 31% of people have type A, and then 38%, although I've read some things that said it wasn't significant. Anyways, my whole point of this is that, I can't just say, oh, I'm type A. That's not good to have, so I'm going to mutate myself to be type B. I mean, we understand that, but like, I just want you to keep that in mind, that the environment itself doesn't cause the mutation. So it's not like the environment favoring one blood type or another is going to cause people's blood types to change. We understand that that happens when your mutations are random events. They're not driven by particular things in the environment, if that makes sense. All right, and then I had to think a couple videos on sexual selection for you guys. So I don't know why my voice is going high like that. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it's kind of the idea that um, in this case we have a male that's very showy here, and it's almost sometimes at the detriment of the animal because this one is more likely to be seen by a predator and eaten. Same thing with this guy here. Same thing with deer and stuff like that. All right, so that's all I'm going to include for that part of it, but those are going to be some factors that we talk about in the next part. And I hope you guys are doing well.